Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever and wherever you are. Welcome to this audio guide for the presidency of John Adams. Yesterday, I took you through the presidency of George Washington. I'll say that was a big bite. Okay, that was a 60-minute video. Today will be a little bit shorter. So if you are here in my class, go ahead and pull out your notes. Part two of the Washington and Adams presidencies, as well as we discussed yesterday the baseball card. I'm going to fill that in about John Adams' key accomplishments. So here we are, day two, the presidency of John Adams. Ready, set, let's go. So here is the man. We finished yesterday looking at a likeness of George Washington. This is a likeness of John Adams. And I don't know, like peer into that, peer into his eyes, look into his soul. What do you think about the man? Students a lot of times look at the curled up mouth and the wrinkles, the eyes and jowls, and he kind of comes off like a grumpy looking man. And I'll tell you at the end of this class why this likeness maybe looks like that. But it also could have been his long life of public service, highs and lows, which is everything we're about to talk about right now. So let's jump into the presidency of John Adams. First, we have to go back to George Washington leaving office, chose to at the end of two terms, didn't have to, but he chose to. And of course, as a reminder, the word precedent, someone doing something for the first time, George Washington leaving office after two terms. Many people were concerned about his departure. The question is, what comes next? And even though he warned against political parties, he asked for unity. There were parties forming or factions. There was mudslinging in the press, and the election of 1796 was very foundational to the American experiment. Remember, there were no guarantees that it would last past Washington, and this is really the first time of a contested presidential election. The first time that we didn't know the votes would go towards George Washington. So this is a very important part of the American experiment. How do we elect the next man? Well, the election of 1796 shapes out like this. Adams, who is in the Federalist camp, received 71 electoral votes, and Jefferson, who has been an anti-Federalist, and we're going to start calling him a Democratic Republican, he received 68 electoral votes, so 71 to 68. And the way it worked at the time was that the top vote getter becomes president, and the second place vote getter becomes vice president. So we have President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson of opposing ideologies. Not quite sure we're going to call them parties just yet, almost. So really, let's just say parties, okay? President and vice president of opposing parties. You know, that's not exactly how it works today, really, because of these early elections where you had a split between the president and the vice president. So today they run on a ticket. That's why you have the same party for P and VP. A little bit more about John Adams here, just kind of an upfront before we dive into the issues of his presidency. So he is a vice president who is elected to the presidency. He serves for one term, 1797 to the year 1800. He does run for re-election and does not win, so we will talk about that. Something about John Adams, we've said his name several times in this class already, so you may remember that he was a son of liberty. I called him a writer, not a fighter. His cousin, Samuel, was the fighter, and he was the lawyer, the legal mind, the academic. So he was certainly a part of the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, an original author of the Declaration of Independence. He helped draft it. And he believes from his lifetime of public service that he deserved the presidency. He's had a long and distinguished career. He's contributed significantly to the revolution and the early government. He helped author the Declaration of Independence. He's been a diplomat to France. He negotiated the treaty that ended the war. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. By gosh, if anyone has earned the office, it's him. It is his time. Now, something to think about. In some ways, it's a whole lot easier to be a president succeeding someone of the opposite party than it is to be the president who takes over almost like a third term of his successor. I mean, like if he was of the opposite party of George Washington, he could have said, all that stuff, that was doing it wrong, and I'm going to do it different. You voted for me. Here's how we're going to do it different. But as George Washington stepped down, a lot of people saw John Adams as just the third term of George Washington. And quite frankly, this was his curse. Right? Think about, here's a sports analogy for you. Think about a really successful football coach. Let's just go with Kirby Smart. We live in Georgia. When Kirby decides to retire, and no matter what else he does with the rest of his career, he is a back-to-back national champion, 2 in a row. So when Kirby decides to retire, man, the guy that takes his job is going to have some big shoes to fill. No matter what that guy does, unless he wins 3 in a row, he's not going to be Kirby. So it's going to be really hard to be the successor in the head coach position of Georgia football, the successor of Kirby Smart. Same story here. Really hard to be the successor of George Washington. John Adams' main problem is that he wasn't George Washington. He was also the physical opposite of Washington. Okay, Washington, tall, of stature, a physical leader of men, his military background. John Adams, the opposite, short, squat, round. His derogatory nickname, was his rotundity, right? Instead of his majesty or his excellency, his opponents called him his rotundity because he was round in the belly. Just several things going against him, especially filling the shoes of George Washington. John Adams has a very significant first. Okay, so remember, George Washington, everything George did was a first, but every president has established their own precedents. And John Adams got to be the first president to live in Washington, D.C., and to live in the White House. About 3.5 years into his presidency, so really right at the end, he moved from New York City to the new, at that time it was called the Executive Mansion. You know it as the White House, but it's called the Executive Mansion in the District of Columbia, first president to live there. So a little bit of a setup for John Adams. Let's look at his presidency here. So he's got a lot of issues, and quite frankly, his presidency is going to be known for the issues, especially in this class and in terms of the vocab we got to jump into. So first issue we're going to talk about is the French plundering American ships. So first of all, so much for friendship, right? Wasn't it the French who helped us in the war? Yes, they joined the war after the Battle of Saratoga, and it was actually the French Navy that helped us be successful at Yorktown. So friends a decade ago, but now amidst the tensions between Britain and France, and remember, George Washington had said, avoid foreign entanglements. He advocated for neutrality. Well, so much for neutrality, right? The French ships are plundering American merchant ships, and you can't just let that happen. You got to do something about it. So in retaliation for Washington's proclamation of neutrality, right, the French were angry that the Americans were not going to support them. Didn't we support you in your time of need? Yes. Shouldn't you support us in our time of need? Well, Washington says remain neutral. So the French response to that is to start seizing American merchant ships. This becomes a disaster for the American economy, right? Everything on that ship, which would have been sold, was destroyed or captured, and the sale was not made, so the money was not made. And this is at the tail end of George Washington's presidency and legacy, and who has to deal with that? John Adams. How does John Adams deal with that? Well, he sends a diplomat, James Monroe, and if you'll look at the president's wall, your right-hand side of the room, you'll see that James Monroe is a future president. But at this time, he's a diplomat sent by John Adams to France to negotiate an end to these hostilities, and he does so quite unsuccessfully. So James Monroe, unsuccessful at negotiating in France, and the response he gets, more than just, oh, that was unsuccessful, and maybe it's just blah. No, the response he gets enrages the nation and, quite frankly, makes things worse. So France was really looking for a bribe. France was looking for, well, let me do one more here. Sorry. What's going on? More than just capturing, more than just attacking the merchant ships, more than just the economy side of it. You see that I move slides here. Is that the French were also impressing sailors into service. And that is something we briefly mentioned yesterday, talking about George Washington. What is impressment? It's a key vocab word, and it's not the last time you're going to hear it in this class. It's capturing sailors from a different nation and forcing them to serve on behalf of the captor's nation. So literally, these American merchant sailors, not even military men, being captured by the French Navy, forced into service in the French Navy. And not only have you lost an American sailor, but now the French have another sailor, and it's a kidnapping situation, a military situation. Not good. overall not good. So the loss of an economic product, right? They can't sell the goods that have been captured. The loss of sailors, and these are American sons who are being captured on the high seas. Obviously, their families back home are angry about that. Hey, Mr. President, what you going to do about it? Here's what he does. He sends James Monroe to France to negotiate. It is quite unsuccessful. Why? Let's look at the why. So when James Monroe arrives in France, France is looking for a bribe. They are saying that they're unwilling to negotiate until you pay us a little money. Grease the palms, if you will, right? You throw us some gold, you throw us some money, then maybe you can have access to our diplomats. And that's just not really how diplomacy is supposed to work. Diplomacy is not a financial transaction. You're supposed to talk to each other and have no matter the outcome of the conversation, at least you had a conversation. Well, this proposal for a bribe basically leads to what is known as the XYZ affair, and that's what you see on your screen at this point. When the French wouldn't meet with the Americans up front, James Monroe and his team, they basically go to a French hotel, fine accommodations, and they are told to wait day after day. Wait, maybe we'll meet with you tomorrow. Wait, maybe we'll meet with you tomorrow. Wait again, maybe we'll meet with you tomorrow. And after several days of this, three French diplomats, come to James Monroe and his team at their hotel, and they meet with the American diplomats in an unofficial diplomatic audience. Technically, this is not negotiations. Technically, this is not the two countries speaking to each other. And in fact, the Frenchmen never even say their names. So they are known in history as Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. And this becomes known as the XYZ affair. Since we don't even know their names, we call them X, Y, and Z. The whole thing gets known as the XYZ affair. Never do we have official negotiations. Never do we have an official audience with anyone in France. The bribe is not paid because that would have been an insult to ourselves as a nation. The whole thing is seen as an insult to our sovereignty as a nation and to our independence as a nation. We were not being treated as a real country. I think about Pinocchio. I'm a real boy now. Well, as Americans, we're about 15 years old. Okay, well, it's on the younger side of being a nation. But we weren't being taken seriously on the world stage, not by France, not by Britain, and this whole thing was seen as an insult. So some people wanted to declare war on France, right? Let's go to war. Like, let's show them who we really are as a new nation. John Adams, this is where leadership matters. This is where the president gets paid to make the big decisions. John Adams knew that we had a small army, just a few thousand troops, a smaller navy, really just about 25 naval vessels, actually with armaments on them. And quite frankly, our young country, toddler, maybe an adolescent, not quite a teenager, our young country would have been no match for the mighty established French army and navy. So the attitude kind of became, let's not rush into this. Let's not do something we can't handle. And that becomes called the quasi-war. So on your screen there, quasi means almost or apparently, not really, not quite. Quasi-war was undeclared. It was on the high seas, so a bit of a naval battle, not land troops, not army versus army in an open field, but a quasi-war results from the XYZ affair. And overall, kind of a conclusion to the XYZ affair and the quasi-war, people see John Adams, President Adams, second to Washington, his rotundity. He comes off as being seen as weak, timid, unaggressive, unleader-like for his failure to answer this challenge to American pride. So his detractors, it was never going to be enough, right? He didn't answer the mail. He didn't stand up for our country, and he's a weakling because of it. So that is the XYZ affair and the quasi-war. More impact at home, kind of a impact at home during this time period is that there's this ideological war between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And actually, we're going to relabel the Anti-Federalists the Democratic Republicans. So not to be confused with either of the main parties today. They are not Democrats. They are not Republicans as we would think of them today. But Thomas Jefferson's crowd, known as the Anti-Federalists, the crowd that demands the Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, the crowd that was more agrarian, more farm-like, less elite, less wealthy, they're going to become known as the Democratic Republicans. And the picture you see on the screen here is a image, kind of a rendering of the chaos that was happening in Congress at this time. There are many instances of representatives of opposing political parties approaching each other and literally fighting in the halls of Congress, on the floors of Congress, canes and umbrellas and bludgeons. These men fought each other on the floor of Congress. And that is certainly not the democracy that we were hoping for, or the democracy that we had designed. Much more related to the boorish behavior of parliaments in Europe. But here we see it in America. And we don't see this in America today. Or for all the divisions we do have, and there's arguments and there's names and labels and insults that maybe get slung around in Congress, but we got to be glad we don't see men fighting on the floors of Congress. So problem that you have here is that the Revolutionary War generation, the guys who used to be all in this together, right? Let's fight the British. Let's oppose them together. We agreed on that. Now we're starting to have ideological splits, and we do, against George Washington's final farewell address advice, we do start to form political parties. So the first two political parties are going to be the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and we're actually going to dive into their beliefs in class tomorrow, an audio guide tomorrow. So just suffice it to say, John Adams' presidency sees a split in politics and the rise of political parties. Well, John Adams attempts to show the other side of himself, attempts to show his strength at home through two other legislative actions. If he was the weakling because of the XYZ affair, he attempts to rebound by showing his tougher side by signing what's known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. So these are two separate actions, and you can see the historic document on the screen there, two separate actions. However, they're always married together. Okay, I don't think we're ever going to see them listed separately. They kind of always go together, and their impact is very similar as well. So first, let's talk about the Alien Act. And when we say alien, I don't mean, green men and we come in peace, take me to your leader. I don't mean aliens from outer space, but the word means foreigner. So just like we might talk about aliens from outer space being foreigners, well, alien is really a word used to refer to immigrants or foreigners. So that's why it's called the Alien Act. The Alien Act empowered the president, John Adams, empowered the president to deport any immigrant or foreigner deemed to be dangerous at his discretion, quite frankly, for any reason at all. And the problem with this legislative action, the problem with this language is that dangerous is wide open to interpretation. Okay, whatever the president considers dangerous, he can use that label to deport someone out of the country. And quite frankly, most of those he considered to be dangerous were recent immigrants, most of them not being wealthy or elite, and most of them being Democratic Republicans. So thus, there was a political aspect to this action. It was a use of power, and many would say an abuse of power, in order to get his political opponents out of the country. And while he was in power, he's thinking towards the next election, he's trying to deport those who are going to vote against him in the next election. So it's definitely largely used against political opponents who spoke out against the president, immigrants who were opposed to the president. And, it's seen as very unconstitutional. Hadn't we just fought a war in order to express our various opinions? Hadn't we just signed a document that gave us freedom of speech? Weren't we a nation built on immigrants? A lot of people, rightfully so, and the opponents of John Adams saw this as very unconstitutional. So that's the Alien Act. Pair it with the Sedition Act. Sedition means speech. Probably not the way we would use that word today, or we don't say, "Oh, you're using sedition against me." No, but sedition means speech. And the Sedition Act criminalized making false statements that were viewed as critical of the government. False statement, also a pretty subjective definition. Critical of the government, that might be a little bit easier to define and understand, but hang on a second. First Amendment, freedom of speech. Isn't this something we all just agreed to in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights? Isn't this something that we were angry that the British were doing to us, jailing people who spoke out against them? John Adams, weren't you a son of liberty? Didn't you fight the same revolution we did? why are you doing this? Why are you criminalizing false statements that are critical of the government? Quite frankly, this Sedition Act, turn on the TV anywhere today, okay, either side of the politics, CNN, Fox News, anything else, turn on that TV and any of those talking heads gabbing about the government, they're going to be guilty of what was John Adams' Sedition Act, right? They are criticizing the government. Difference is today we value that alternate point of view, and even if there's disagreements and name calling, and there's plenty of negativity that comes from that division. At least we're allowed to.
Call the front office, Queen Johnson.
I knew that would happen at some point during these audio guides. Today on TV, any of those talking heads, CNN or Fox News, would have been guilty of the Sedition Act, but today they're allowed to do it because it is freedom of speech. So this was seen as Republicans, or Democrat Republicans is really what that should say, as measures against the freedom of speech. This basically trampled the Constitution. It's almost like, hadn't we just signed this thing? Was the ink even wet yet? It's almost like saying, freedom, yeah, that's a nice idea on a piece of paper, this piece of paper we just negotiated on, but we're not really going to do that in the Adams administration. That's what these actions were. So very controversial overall. I like this little graphic here, and it says the Declaration of Independence was signed by 8 immigrants. And here, the second president of the United States is imposing an action that is anti-immigrant, right? It's almost like we forgot where we came from, that immigrants were always a part of the revolutionary attitude, and quite frankly, put their lives on the line in service by signing the Declaration. But here, the John Adams administration is not in favor of immigrants. And quite frankly, weren't we all immigrants at one time? Or at least our family line was immigrants to America at one time. So lots to think about there, and controversial, obviously controversial for a reason. Well, opposition to the acts, the picture you see on the screen is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, to include James Madison, were opposed to these actions, and they were outspoken with their anger to these acts. Some 2 states in particular actually passed resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Acts. So this is called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which are a formal statement against the acts. They use the language that they are alarming infractions upon constitutional rights. And these 2 states and several others, Kentucky, Virginia, and others, refused to enforce them. So now we have the seeds planted for the battle between federal power and so-called states' rights. In this example, Kentucky and Virginia say, I don't care what Congress passed. In Kentucky, we're not deporting immigrants. In Kentucky, we're not arresting people for making statements critical of the government. And, the bottom line is what we've agreed to, what we believe in, is that the federal law overpowers or supersedes, is the better word, state law. So this is the beginning of states saying that they can make their own decisions no matter what the federal government says. And we're not yet on the edge of the Civil War, but the Civil War is going to hinge on very similar ideas. States deciding what's right for them, breaking with the federal union because of it. So we're walking towards the next big conflict, which is the Civil War. In total, anger over these actions, the unpopularity of these acts, leads Thomas Jefferson to break with his president. He's the vice president, and he decides to run for president again in the election of 1800. Because of the unpopularity of these acts, John Adams really doesn't stand a chance against Thomas Jefferson. And the next election is going to be very crucial to the American experiment. Let me set the stage by reminding you that these 2 gentlemen were once compadres, brothers in arms. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, also in the picture is Benjamin Franklin. These are the big 3 that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson being the primary author, but his comradeship, his friendship with John Adams goes way back into the revolutionary time frame. However, they've had a split in ideas, and they do represent different political parties. And in the election of 1800, we have Adams versus Jefferson, and sometimes the election of 1800 is called the Revolution of 1800, and we can't use that word lightly. I mean, we fought a revolution, and a revolution means change through ideas. So the revolution of 1800 is going to continue to be one of those foundational waypoints towards the America we live in today. So what happened in the election of 1800? Well, the election was riddled with personal attacks. Today we might call that mudslinging, or opposition reporting, where the candidates try to, instead of advocating for themselves, this is what I stand for, vote for me, they break down their opponent. And again, I said that's called mudslinging. Like, don't vote for him because he's a bad guy. So I mean, two philosophies there: vote for me because, or mudslinging is don't vote for him because. So we see a lot of personal attacks. The hostility in the election made a lot of people concerned about the transfer of power. See, first president, Washington, 2 terms, got it. The next president comes from the same party, even though we didn't really have parties just yet. But Washington to Adams really wasn't that big of a transfer of power. This time, with the 2 candidates hostile towards each other, the transfer of power is going to be an important thing for the sake of America. And what happened really proved to be the turning point for the presidency and for American politics. See, I've used this phrase several times at this point in both of these audio guides. This was still an experiment. There was no guarantees that this government would last past Washington's time. Washington to Adams, and now we have the very tense circumstances of the election of 1800. We owe John Adams, in his defeat, we owe him a great deal for what he did after the election of 1800. He was the first president who was defeated in running for re-election to accept his defeat, to pack up his items and leave the White House. The first time that a sitting president willingly gave up power, willingly gave up the office of the president to a man of the opposing political party. And this is a very important precedent set by John Adams, a first. Washington's not the only one that can set precedents. Very important precedent set by John Adams. Unheard of for the time period, right? Go back to the monarchies and, kings and monarchs who were in power for 30, 40, 50 years for life, really. So unheard of for the time period, but very important. It shows the world, and the world is watching. It shows the world that the American government is working, that the defeated president will willingly give up power, and that the new president can move in with no war and with no fighting. Here's a quote from George Washington, and it's a very important sentiment. Whether he said it exactly like this or not is a little debatable, but the sentiment is absolutely true to Washington. He says this: what is most important of this grand experiment, the United States? Not the election of the first president, but the election of its second president. The peaceful transition of power is what will separate this country from every other country in the world. But as it were, it was not the election of the second, but the election of the third. And it was the first time that power was transferred to an opposing party. The peaceful transition of power is what will separate this country from every other country in the world. So on Inauguration Day, which at the time was March 4th, 1801, John Adams quietly packs up his bags and leaves what is known as Washington City. Will become Washington, D.C. later. He does not attend the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, and that is probably for the best. This is the first time that a president does not attend the inauguration of his opponent, and it is but it will be the last time until the transfer of power between president number 45 and 46. Let me bring you into the present term, and I always like to fit my personal experiences into class, so I'll do that here. I very unexpectedly got to attend the inauguration of our 46th president, President Biden, and I did not attend as a private citizen. I did not attend in civilian clothing. I attended as a captain in the Georgia Army National Guard in uniform and carrying a weapon at what was a very closed off and locked down inauguration. See, there's a picture of me. And yeah, I paused for the photo op. That is the Capitol building, and where you see the flags, this is essentially the podium where the president stands, gives his speech, swears in, takes the oath of office. But what you really need to notice is the fencing, the barbed wire, and the saddest part of the photo is this grass, which should be filled with people celebrating the transfer of power from one president to another. But unfortunately, due to the events of January 6, 2021, The inauguration of President Biden becomes very closed off, and very few people attended. In fact, I would say more military people attended in duty than people attended who had a ticket. Congressional representatives, congressmen, and senators were allowed to attend. I believe they had one extra ticket each. So whether that's for a spouse or maybe a son or a daughter, they were allowed to come and attend in the very few seats that are right there. But realistically, in all inaugurations past, one, the fencing is not there. The razor wire is certainly not there. And all this grass is like standing room only, because no matter what party you're a part of, you are celebrating the peaceful transition of power. Well, John Adams did not attend Thomas Jefferson's transfer of power, and that was probably for the best. Donald Trump did not attend Joe Biden's transfer of power, and I will plainly say that was probably also for the best. This was my view of the moment that President Biden swore in, and you can see that I couldn't have asked for a better view. Literally, 50-yard line, if you will, sports analogies, and you can see the whole pomp and circumstance of the ceremony. You see very few seats that are filled, as I've already described, but I am happy to report I did witness a peaceful transfer of power. I was on duty, so I was not there as a citizen. I was there as a captain in the Army, and I did have responsibilities on that day. And we fulfilled our responsibilities, our duty, and I witnessed a peaceful transfer of power. Closed off, but a peaceful transfer of power. So take the old, make the comparison from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and I'll bring it into the current. And we say this a lot: if you don't study history, you're condemned to repeat it. Or sometimes history is just going to be a cycle anyway. So what we saw in the election of 1800, we also saw in the election of 2020. So make a comparison between those two inaugurations. You might ask, what became of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams? Are they rivals for forever? Do they hate each other to the grave? Or do they mend their friendship? Well, let me tell you that story. After Thomas Jefferson served 2 terms, he is in office from 1801 until 1809. Jefferson and Adams did not communicate during that time frame, right? They did not rely on each other. Jefferson didn't ask Adams for advice. They were bitter rivals during that time frame. But in 1812, through third parties who respected each other, both men communicated the desire to rekindle a friendship, or at least to break the silence. John Adams was the first to break the silence. He sends Thomas Jefferson a letter on January 1st, 1812. That's New Year's Day. And in this letter, he simply wishes Thomas Jefferson a happy new year and many happy new years to come. 12 years later, breaks the silence. I got to think that these guys are remembering what they've already come through. The fact that they authored the Declaration of Independence together. They were sons of liberty and revolutionaries together. And despite 12 years of hardship, John Adams breaks the silence. Jefferson replies. He responds with a note where he recalls their old times together when they were laborers in the same cause, is the words that he used. And from this point on, 1812, to their deaths, these men resumed their friendship, corresponded via letter into their golden years. So their friendship, the answer to my question, are they rivals forever or do they mend their friendship? The answer is that they do mend their friendship. So now you're probably wondering, how does it end? How does it truly end? Well, July 4th, 1826, this is 14 years after the mending of their friendship. At the age of 90, Adams is laying on his deathbed as the country is celebrating Independence Day. July 4th, pretty ironic, right? Well, these two men, in their rekindled friendship years, they created a bet with each other, and maybe some of y'all have ongoing bets with each other. Their bet with each other was who would live the longest. So John Adams, laying on his deathbed on Independence Day, his last words, literally his last words are, Thomas Jefferson still lives, as if to say Thomas Jefferson wins the bet. Well, here's what he didn't know. He was mistaken. Thomas Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams die on the same day, is July 4th, 1826, do the math, that's 50 years after the original adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Like, could you write a more American story than that? So just a little conclusion to the legacy of both of these men, that they both die on the same day. And technically, John Adams does win the bet, although he doesn't know that because the pace of communication, he was not able to learn that Thomas Jefferson had passed away first. Finish it out with a little bit of the legacy of John Adams. So on the screen here, this is John Quincy Adams, the 6th president of the United States. We haven't gotten there yet, but you can know that this is John Adams' son. So a father, son, who are the president. And John Adams, one time I was reading an article. I do a lot of reading. I was reading an article, and the statement was made that kids have it so easy these days. Kids these days have it so easy. And a responder to this article said, yeah, isn't that the point? Like, isn't that exactly the point? Don't you want your kids to have it easier than you have it? I do. I'll speak as a parent. I want my kids to live easier, better than I live. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't struggle and have challenges and grow as a human, but I want them to live in a better world than I live in. And there's a quote from John Adams that says this perfectly. He says this: I must study politics and war so that my sons may have the liberty to study math and philosophy. Our sons ought to study math, philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and architecture and agriculture in order to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, music, tapestry, porcelain, the arts. He's saying, I do the hard things as a revolutionary so that my kid can have an easier life. He then owes it to my grandkids to do the work so that they can have an easier life. And we don't need to live in this perpetual cycle of war. We fought for independence and liberty. Let's make sure the next generations have an easier go at it. So pretty powerful legacy. And guess what? John Quincy Adams did study the arts and the humanities. He was not a wartime president. And that's not to say our country doesn't go back to war. But John Quincy Adams did get to live out what his father hoped for. He had an easier life. Back to our starting picture here. So this is John Adams, and we kind of pointed out his wrinkled mouth and his the wrinkles around his eyes. This is actually this is a statue, a wax figure actually that was created from a life mask, and this life mask was taken 7 months before he died. So very similar to the way we looked at George Washington's sculpture, and his granddaughter said, yep, that's my grandfather. This comes from, so the process is, I'll go to the next picture here, the process would be to plaster the person's face, and that plaster then hardens, and with that mold, you can then fill it with a harder resin, or some people would use marble to create those with art skills, which is not me, use marble or bronze to create a lasting impression of the person's face. And you can see that they did it on his whole upper torso, really, right, all the way around his head, his ears, his shoulders and whatnot. And this actually happened 7 months before he died. And the reason this is not so popular today, because today we have photography. But before photography, this is a way that historical figures could be captured in their likeness. And this is a great example of a 360-degree perspective of John Adams. So I like to show this next picture. How do you think they did? All right, if this is his likeness, how do you think the statue did? I think pretty good. Now, to his mouth and the wrinkles and the grumpy old man look, in this plastering process, you'd have to be still for hours. So I don't know how many of you can hold a smile for hours. Not many. So that's why their face was often just very expressionless while they were posing for their life mask. Sometimes this also happened in death. That would be called a death mask. If the life mask wasn't taken before the person died and they wanted to remember the figure, they would take the plaster mask in their death. So death mask, life mask, statue, and commonly the portrait that we show of John Adams. I think they did pretty good. I'm always pretty amazed at how these historical figures are captured in the days before photography. And since our class isn't yet at the point of photography and video, I do show you a lot of paintings and sculptures so that we can try to understand who these people look like. So to finally close the slides here, this was shorter than yesterday. You do have a couple of things in the packet you need to get to. If you haven't read the articles, do. If you haven't accomplished the Washington's farewell address article, do. You'll notice that the very first article in the packet is an article called "What is an American?" and should be implied. I'll make it specified. You need to accomplish this article as well. So there's plenty of things for you to do in this class period. I have posted a handful of videos as well. What did the founding fathers and other historical figures really look like? You get some more information on that. John Adams in 60 seconds, as well as I'll post this for the next several days. This actually comes from the Georgia GSE, which is the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Basically, this is an EOC prep video. So, hey, we take the Georgia GSE EOC. You might want to watch the video that actually comes from Georgia GSE because it's going to cover the stuff that is important for our end of course exam. So continue to do the right thing, especially with the substitute in the room. Thank you for making it possible. Thank you for learning while I'm gone. And the education doesn't have to stop. I've done my best to bring you the information, and you can still wrestle with that information in your self-study. I've posted several things to include my teaching notes. So if you want to browse the notes that I lecture off of, they're right in front of you as well. And with that said, the story of us continues. And Selah picked this one. See you later.